3, which is entitled "With Soul of Flame and Temper of Steel." And we began last time, we just started to touch upon this, and we just got into it a little bit, but just for a quick recap, where we ended last session was just talking about, the presidents up to Andrew Johnson, and how there'd been good presidents and bad presidents, and effective presidents and ineffective presidents, and presidents who were, just really in it for themselves, and presidents who were really in it for the good of the country. And we closed last time just sharing with each other that knowing history and, understanding history, presidential history, American history, can be a very reassuring and comforting thing in times of difficulty, because we can receive the assurance that while we may be going through difficult times and trying times and frightening times, it's not the first time we've gone through them. It won't be the last. And we somehow right ourselves, so that, as John Meacham keeps talking about when he quotes Abraham Lincoln, that the better angels of our nature will have the final say. And for the bulk of our history, we've had that. And so as we go through today, and as we go through all the issues that we're going through in our nation, racially, economically, the coronavirus, and politically, with Soul of Flame and Temper of Steel, I think is an appropriate title in the sense that, we have some strength, and our history really can give us some strength and encouragement. So that's my hope for today, and actually for each session. If you can't hear, like I said, feel free to chime in, let me know. Also, if there's something that you think about that you want to share, please feel free to raise your hand and unmute yourself and offer it to the group. You don't need to hear just Ricky for an hour. That would be too much Ricky. And too much of a good thing is never good. So you don't want too much of me. So where we began last, or where we ended last time, also was we started focusing on Teddy Roosevelt. And so Teddy Roosevelt he lived his life in terms of what was right and what was wrong, and his position on changing the nature of the country, and this is starting on page 75 in the book if you wanted to follow along, was perfectly clear. John Meacham writes about Teddy Roosevelt that he says, "It is a base outrage to oppose a man because of his religion or birthplace, and all good citizens would hold any such effort in abhorrence." Isn't it amazing how appropriate those words are to today?
Absolutely.
It speaks to our time today, which can also assure us that these issues confronted others in our nation in ages past. And then he goes on, this was a sentiment that was, as we know and are living through, more easily articulated than realized, even for Teddy Roosevelt himself. So Teddy Roosevelt, his capacity on some occasions was to stand for equality and openness, and in other contexts, to argue that it was the destiny of the Anglo-Saxon peoples to rule the world. And we were a particular example of a more, or I'm sorry, forgive me, that he was a more particular example of a universal American inconsistency. And that inconsistency that Teddy Roosevelt embodies is, we believe in life and liberty for some, and we simultaneously believe in imposing our will on others. Have you seen that experience come to bear in our country's history, in your own life? Anybody have anything you want to share with that? Yeah, Susan.
Well, I was thinking that aren't they thinking about removing his statue from the Museum of Natural History? I'm not sure which museum in New York.
Natural history.
Natural history was the Teddy Roosevelt. Yeah, that was his museum.
Because the way I don't know who made the statue, but the way they made it, it really embodies the last quote that you said about, not the first one about equality, because I looked at it to see why they wanted to get rid of it. But he's like on a horse and he's got two people of different races looking very subservient. So that's not, if you're portraying him, there's two sides to him, that's portraying the very good side.
Susan, that's such a great observation. And oftentimes in statues, you get a one-sided portrayal rather than a more complex portrayal of the whole person, and which would, I think, create more of an opportunity for a conversation, wouldn't it? If you had that piece of Teddy Roosevelt and another part to Teddy Roosevelt. And that would be a fascinating way to go. And, you know, just to shift, well, let's digress a little bit, you know, to, if you look at the statue in, why can't I think of it right now? Oh, forgive me, of Robert Gould Shaw in Boston. Has anybody ever seen, you know, the Colonel Shaw's statue? And,
Yeah,
you know,
sure.
since he led the first, you know, one of the first, there were the first two, he led one of the first Black regiments in the Civil War.
Oh, yeah.
And forgive me, I can't remember the name of the artist who sculpted it, but he was a racist, but he, the sculptor of it was, that is, and, but he, as he was sculpting, he really started to see the humanity of people of color, and his artistic, you know, I was learning about him and reading a documentary about him, and his artistic sensibilities started conversing with his, you know, prejudices, and it ended up being a really marvelous statue that shows the complexities. And, you know, so Susan, it would be nice if the Roosevelt statue were done more like the Shaw statue, or perchance they could have a conversation about, well, that was one piece, how about the other piece? And it's interesting how Roosevelt embodies both. He really does. And so it's appropriate that we're speaking about him because he really embodies some of the complexities
The place, it's probably his home.
of our nation.
Most of people think the building's open.
So, so I'm not sure where they are, Susan, right now in terms of the of that statue and its removal. And keep me posted if you hear anything, please, on that, Susan, and that would be great.
I'll try to find out.
He also, you know, so to that point, also, he believed that lives and liberties of others, you know, he believed that some were innately inferior, you know, to white Anglo-Saxons, something we still wrestle with in our nation. And the tensions between these two versions of Theodore Roosevelt, you know, these identities, you know, assimilation of people, and also at the same time, you know, assimilating everybody being one identity, and then the other identity, forgive me, being power over people. Both of those have shaped American life, and really shaped it in the age of the first Roosevelts, especially Teddy Roosevelt. You know, he was an irrepressible person. He had a huge personality. He, I loved, we ended last time, and I want to bring this quote up again. Remember his daughter Alice, from his first wife who had died. Alice Roosevelt Longworth said of her father that he wanted, this is Teddy Roosevelt, that Teddy Roosevelt wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. He wanted to be the center. He really, really did. And his conviction, though, on the good side, was that others must be cared for and helped. That comes from his father. You know, his father, whom they called Greatheart, was someone who used his wealth to better the lives of others. But Teddy Roosevelt's mother also shaped his ethos. Remember, so his father is from the old New York Roosevelts of Manhattan. His mother was from the South, and was deeply sympathetic to the Southern cause. And this is in the Civil War era, and is in the mid-1800s. So that when the Civil War comes about, Theodore Roosevelt, the first, Teddy Roosevelt's father, he hired someone to fight in his place, which was something you could do if you had enough money in those days. And Teddy Roosevelt, the one who became president, was deeply ashamed of his father's not going to war and defending the country. But it's interesting how Teddy Roosevelt is really a microcosm of the entire nation. He's got his father's sensibilities for helping people in him. He has his mother's sensibilities for, Southern sensibilities of, the white way is the right way in him as well. So he has both. Now, his commitment to, progressive causes, in other words, helping lift up all people, that really comes from his dad. And his emerging convictions about helping the poor and persecuted is strengthened in about 1890 by a Jacob Riis publication entitled How the Other Half Lives. And Riis was an immigrant from Denmark who took powerful photographs of tenement life in Manhattan, in New York City. And those photographs astonished Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt says, by this time I was getting our social, industrial, and political needs into pretty fair perspective, well awakened to the need of making ours in good faith, both an economic and an industrial, as well as a political democracy. So from the pictures of that extreme poverty, Teddy Roosevelt discovers that our country needs to be an economic democracy as well as a political democracy. And that it should not be that, the blessings of this nation are reserved for the wealthy few. And then on page 80, John Meacham gives this great quote. Teddy Roosevelt says, "I've always had a horror of words that are not translated into deeds. I've had a horror of speech that does not result in action. I believe in realizable ideals, and in realizing them, in preaching what can be practiced and then practicing it." He wanted to be a doer, not just a pontificator. And so that was the way he lived his life. And that, that kind of kept in check some of his other beliefs in terms of his superiority or white superiority over others. So before he was done with all of his public service, and after his police posting, after his governorship, after his vice presidency, after his presidency, and after Teddy Roosevelt's unsuccessful 1912 presidential campaign, he fought against corrupt machine politics in New York in particular and in Washington in general. He fought against business monopolies. He fought against abysmal working conditions, and Teddy Roosevelt also crusaded for conservation of natural resources, for government regulation of railroads. He crusaded for food safety. He ended up evolving and crusaded for women's suffrage, which at first he really wasn't concerned over, and he crusaded for political reform. So in all of this, Teddy Roosevelt anticipated the work of his cousin Franklin and of Harry Truman and of Lyndon Johnson. Teddy Roosevelt writes, "The nation and government within the range of fair play and a just administration of the law must inevitably sympathize with the men who have nothing but their wages, with the men who are struggling for a decent life." And that is really where he came down. So he oftentimes landed on the side of the better angels of his nature. Not always, but often. And which was a wonderful thing for us and for the country. Any thoughts, questions so far? Observations? Or should I move along?
I think might be a picture coming on. That's
I'll
why
move along. So let's see here. Let me just in the next section, another section that was a dominant issue for Teddy Roosevelt in his time was immigration. Immigration was a dominant issue in Teddy Roosevelt's America. And it's been an enduring issue in our nation from the beginning, from the very beginning, right? It's always been a source of political discontent. It's always been a source of heated debate. In 1798, so let's go way back now. In 1798, we have the Alien and Sedition Acts, which are signed by John Adams to protect, in President Adams' view, the national interest against internal dissent and outside agitation. So what that act did was increase the numbers of years that applicants for citizenship to this country had to wait. And it authorized the president to deport any foreigner whom he deemed dangerous to the country. Isn't that something? So, and that was our second president who said, I want the authority to deport anyone that I deem dangerous to this country, who came here, who immigrated to this nation. And, wasn't one of John Adams' shining moments, but we had that. Also, James Madison wrote of this bill to Thomas Jefferson. The alien bill proposed in the Senate is a monster that must ever disgrace its parents. He thought, so James Madison, father of our Constitution, really the author of our Constitution, he thought it was horrible. Then in 1783, George Washington articulates what we like to think of the American way on immigration. George Washington said, he writes, the bosom of America is open to receive not only the opulent and respectable stranger, but the oppressed and the persecuted of all nations and all religions. And that's our first president speaking. But fears of indiscriminate immigration have been present since America's founding, because in 1802, Alexander Hamilton himself, who was an immigrant, had reservations. And Alexander Hamilton writes, the influx of foreigners must tend to produce a heterogeneous compound, to change and corrupt the national spirit, to complicate and confound public opinion, to introduce foreign propensities. So here you have this immigrant who gets in saying, we don't need any more immigrants getting in. So it's interesting, isn't it, to see how this has been with us from the beginning. So, you have that sense, that Rooseveltian, that Teddy Rooseveltian, conflict or consternation within our nation of, we want to do great good. But you know what? The ones of us who are here and assimilated, we're a little better than some of the ones that may bring some different things in. And we've always been struggling with that. And then John Meacham goes on and he writes that we've never been as open as a nation as we'd like to think. But at our best, we've managed to remain truer to the spirit of George Washington than to the spirit of Alexander Hamilton, which is true overall, isn't it? How many of you, did you have family members that you remember, that you can recall, that came into the nation from other nations that emigrated?
Yes.
Estelle, do you want to share a little bit about that?
Well, my mother and my father both came from Europe. My father from Poland as a young adult, and my mother as a 13-year-old orphan from Russia, from Belarus.
Wow.
Yes, she traveled with a cousin. They came on the Amsterdam, I think the Rotterdam. And
Okay.
I was able to find her records at Ellis Island some years ago. And it was terrifying. She came to live with family, but it was terrifying for her. And she recalled that many, many years later.
I believe it. Oh, Estelle, thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate that. It had to be terrifying. Anybody else have a story of a family member, if not yourself?
Yes, my father came from Scotland in 1912, and he told the story about it was before the Titanic sank.
My grandmothers and one grandfather came from Ireland also in 1912, and my grandmother had a ticket on the Titanic.
Ah,
She would have been in steerage, but she missed the connecting boat from Ireland to England, so she
thank
missed it.
goodness.
Wow.
Yeah.
Boy, thank the Lord, Susan. Wow. And it's amazing, isn't it? You know, Lisa, my wife Lisa, who was on the call earlier, who works for the senior center, her father came over from Germany as a 6-year-old child on a boat. And he wasn't with his father. His dad came over, they came over in the very early 1930s. 1931 is when my father-in-law came over when he was alive, because their family saw everything that was happening in Germany. And it terrified them, even though they weren't Jewish. And, you know, so my wife's grandfather decided he had to get out of there and earn money and get his family out. And just listening to stories that, you know, he wouldn't tell them until the final year of his life, you know, why he never wanted to go back to Germany, why he didn't want to have his family go back, why he didn't want to speak German. You know, it's interesting hearing and, you know, and just seeing the opportunity as well as the fear as a 6-year-old boy coming over to this country. I can't fathom somebody dropping me on a boat at 6 years old and saying, you know, go, your dad will meet you. Just extraordinary.
They do that, yeah. Little kids.
Right?
Rick,
Yeah,
just a comment.
go for it, John.
You know, I was listening to a college professor give an online presentation on immigration on C-SPAN. And one of the things he said was, in the history of American immigration, there's always been a pull and a push. A push, meaning from the countries from which people leave, there is a push, some economic, some physical, some political, some war. And on the pull part, as far as the United States, there is a desire to have people to immigrate for purposes mostly of growth. So his explanation, and he went through many of these acts and immigration laws that you are going to cover, but underneath each of them is a motivation. You know, the Sedition Act or the Alien Act was because the young country was worried about France and England endangering the new republic. So they didn't want a number of people coming from a country that was intended to undermine the new republic. So, because remember, the push and the pull is still always a natural thing. Anyway, I just think that after talking about these acts and these legislative things, about what makes them, what creates the reason for them, it would be nice to be able to discuss or understand the underlying causes of them in relation to our history. So it would be a little, I think it deserves a little more in-depth look, not tonight or today, but if it piques your interest, you can go out and Google Sedition Act and look at what historians say about it. I mean, beyond what John Meacham says about it. That's my comment.
Oh, John, thank you so much for sharing that, because the context can be so important to it, you know, and thank you for that ever so much. And you get that through all of those, you know, you get that through a lot. And so if you balance those out with immigration stories of people and then things they experienced, you really do need that context. You know, my brother-in-law lived in Cuba, and when Fidel Castro took over, he and his family fled. He ended up in his pajamas, you know, on a boat and came over. And just hearing some of those stories, and thank you, John, ever so much for that, because the context is important. And then let's see. So you have that we talked about, Alien Sedition. It happens in the 1800s. You get the same kind of let's close things down in this country, you know, when you have the Know Nothing Party. And they spring up in a reaction to a wave of European immigration in the wake of revolutions in the 1840s, you know, when Europe was going through all kinds of consternation and people were flooding over here. So like you were saying, you know, John, that push, you know, and the pull toward this nation. And then it happens in 1881 through 1885, Chester Arthur's president, you have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is passed in reaction to fears of competing labor coming from the Far East. And people were really worried that all these Chinese coming over were going to take our jobs. So isn't it interesting how you have the same issues come up
Yeah,
again,
over and over again.
again, and again?
Mhm.
And my mother's family, my great-grandfather who came over from Ireland, you know, and they were worried that these Irish people were going to take their jobs. And so she ended up just as a maid. She said that's what they could do. And so think about all of that. And, you know, you have all of that, but at the same time, you've got that spirit of George Washington here. And so they both are, you know, I don't know if I want to say they're competing with each other or warring with each other, but they pull against one another, you know, and our nation, we seem to swing, you know, maybe not in extremes, but we swing toward times when we are more open to receiving people. And then we swing toward times when we're closed and don't want to have folks here. So you've got that piece, you know, and that all flavors Teddy Roosevelt and his belief that, you know, this nation was here for everybody. And at the same time, his belief that, you know, everybody should really do things the way that we do them because we know what's best. And that kind of is probably somewhat in all of us who have grown up in the nation that we've grown up in, which is a marvelous place. So it's natural that we think our way is the best way. And even though it's not always the best way. Before we go any further with Teddy Roosevelt, I just want to show a video clip about him and about, you know, part of his better angel when he became president, you know, and just this is the introduction to Teddy Roosevelt from the Ken Burns series on the Roosevelts in Intimate History. So I'm going to do a screen share and I'm going to play this piece of the video. It is about almost 7 minutes long. So before I put it on a full screen with the video, please raise your hand if you can't hear it or can't see it, okay? And then I'm gonna pause it and just make sure that we're good to go. And so let me pull that up.
We don't seem to have a.
We didn't check in. I don't want to
Back it up a second. And I'm gonna, so I've got that. I'm gonna minimize it. I'm gonna pull it over here.
You touch our picture, amen.
And all righty. So I am going to share
Never
this
did let us in.
screen. And
Switch to
what we're going to share is this one. We're going to share the computer sound. And we're going to optimize for a video clip. So I want to make sure, can everybody see that little snippet of the Roosevelts on your screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm just going to play a little bit of it for a second and just say Rick or something if you can't hear it.
To your PBS station from viewers like you.
Can everybody hear
Thank
that?
you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Before
I'll
the
put it on a
names
full
Theodore,
screen.
Eleanor, and Franklin
So this is just
were
the test
indelibly
run,
etched
not
into the
front
American
end.
consciousness. And the course of human history was forever changed by their individual endeavors. A prominent family made a point of teaching the value of altruism, the power of perseverance, and the virtue of helping out one's fellow man.
Everybody's good with it?
For the first few nights of his new presidency, Theodore Roosevelt slept at the home of his sister Bamie at 1733 N Street, while the widow of his murdered predecessor, William McKinley, packed up to leave Washington. But every morning at 8:30, he started toward his office in the executive mansion 10 blocks away, while his secretary struggled to keep up. His first night there was to be September 23, 1901, and since his wife and children had not yet arrived, he asked his sisters, Bamie and Corinne, and their husbands to join him for dinner. The day before had been the birthday of the man whose memory meant the most to him, his father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr. What would I not give if only he could have lived to see me here in the White House, the president said. Then he noticed that the flowers on the dinner table were Sophronia roses, the same variety his father had worn every day in his buttonhole. I feel as if my father's hand were on my shoulder, Roosevelt said, as if there were a special blessing over the life I am to lead here.
The man and the moment were perfectly met. This was America at the turn of what was to become, and Americans already felt it, the American century. Science was in the air, telephones, internal combustion engines, airplanes, all kinds of stuff. And here came this man who was called a steam engine in trousers. He just embodied the moment.
Roosevelt has the knack of doing things, and doing them noisily, clamorously. While he is in the neighborhood, the public can no more look the other way than the small boy can turn his head away from a circus parade followed by a steam calliope.
Theodore Roosevelt would prove to be a brand new kind of president for a brand new century. But at first, no one knew precisely in which direction Roosevelt would lead his parade. In the decades after Abraham Lincoln, most American presidents had been content to be caretakers. Real power lay with the Congress, with the party machines that controlled what did and did not happen on Capitol Hill, and with the financial giants whose power grew steadily and whose orders many senators followed without a second thought. I did not care a rap for the form and show of power, Roosevelt remembered. I cared immensely for the use that could be made of the substance. One admirer hailed him as a stream of fresh, pure, bracing air from the mountains, sent to clear the fetid atmosphere of the national capital. But the novelist Henry James dismissed him as the monstrous embodiment of unprecedented and resounding noise. You must always remember, his friend the French ambassador warned, that the president is about 6.
I'm no poet, and in writing, I'm afraid I'm not gifted at all. If I have anything at all resembling genius, it is the gift of leadership.
He was the youngest president in history, just 42. The first to have been born in a city, the first to be known by his initials, TR. He was an author and naturalist, birdwatcher and big game hunter, historian and expansionist, moral crusader and shrewd politician. And he was also a proud husband and father, whose 6 boisterous children transformed the dark, formal executive mansion into a giant playhouse overnight.
He is a hyperactive adult, is what Theodore Roosevelt is. But the man is brilliant. I think he's very close to a genius, if there is such a thing as a genius, of all the presidents of the United States. He could speed read before anybody knew the expression, let alone how to do it, and quote from what he'd read 5 years later. He spoke a variety of languages terribly, almost incomprehensibly in some cases, but that didn't slow him down.
The first president to go down in a submarine. The first president to leave the country during the course of his time in office. The first president to send a transatlantic cable for the purposes of diplomacy. The first president to own an automobile. And more important than all of those, the first president to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And greater still, the first president ever to invite an African American to dine with him in the White House. And that's a short list.
He had pledged to continue absolutely unbroken the policy of President McKinley, but he also had a reputation for independence and unpredictability. He had been taught by his father to view the world in terms of right and wrong, and to see himself always as the defender of the right.
He carried a pulpit around with him. He really was. This bully pulpit was an appendage. He was a moralist, first, last, and always, and not one racked by doubts.
He also understood modern technology. He understood the cycles of the newspaper business. He understood that he could claim center stage if he wanted to. And by claiming center stage, he could get his message out to the American people in a way previous presidents often had not bothered to.
Among those waiting most eagerly to see what Theodore
All right, so we'll stop there for now, and then there's another clip we'll show in a little bit. So he really embodies so many things and so many firsts at the beginning of, the 20th century, which really was viewed as the American century. And so think about those things you heard from the video. And then we're going to move on a little bit. And then I'm going to show another piece of the video. So remember all the firsts. And one of the first was he was the first president to invite a black man to the White House. So let's go a little bit through reform and racism in Teddy Roosevelt's tenure. So in his era, Teddy Roosevelt's era, it was imbued with ideas of reform and racial superiority. Doesn't seem like things have changed, does it? It's amazing how similar things are. The movement for economic injustice and working condition improvements was simultaneous with the spread of eugenics and with quasi-Darwinian notions, influenced by the work of someone named Herbert Spencer, who was a white supremacist and really focused on white hegemony. In other words, it should, be white rule. So eugenics is making people to be perfectly white. And that was a big thing that was becoming popular at the same time that all these reform efforts in factories and economically were happening. So how many of you have heard that term, survival of the fittest?
Yes, Darwin.
We all figure it's Darwin. I as well thought it was Darwin. And so the author of that is not Charles Darwin, but it was Eugene Spencer. I think that Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer, who said survival of the fittest. And, and then he figured the fittest were those who were Northern European. And so you have him, and then another eugenicist and white supremacist named Madison Grant, who during Teddy Roosevelt's time worried about the rise of the Slovak, the Italian, the Syrian, and the Jew. And they worried that these people would soon displace what he argued was the American strain from the Teutonic part of the British Isles that was almost purely Nordic. So he worried that all these, Jewish people and Southern Europeans were just going to wreck everything, that it was not going to be good. And if you have anybody from any of those descents, you may have felt the biting end of that. Yeah. My mom is Italian, and my great-grandfather came from Italy, had a really thick Italian accent, and they weren't popular. They looked different, and even, in my family, my dad, who is, Northern European, British and German, mostly German, will say, oh, you look so Italian, your nose and your hair, and why can't it ever look... And then he'll say to me, Ricky, why can't it ever look like you've shaved? It looks like you're perpetually unshaven. And he goes, that's your Italian, and so, you get that. And I've thought to myself, just majoring in sociology and all that, wow, that's your prejudice coming out against your own son. But that's because we're all a microcosm of our culture. And so that's there. And Teddy Roosevelt shares that Anglo-Saxon imperialism part. You know, his family's Dutch, pretty far Northern European, but his white supremacist views, which he did hold, and to your point, Susan, that's why they want to take that statue down, you know. So Teddy Roosevelt's white supremacist views were redeemed by some of his basic aversions to nativism. He didn't want to shut the country down. He didn't want to close people out of it. He really felt that this was a land of opportunity, and he believed in extending a welcome to everyone who comes here that's intent, you know, on becoming a U.S. citizen. He wanted to welcome them. And I just wanted to read to you a quote of his on page 85 of the book.
No, don't do that.
What?
Let me read that to you.
Good idea.
What?
So,
It's happy.
just listen
Do you
to
want me
this,
to go away?
to this one piece. And
They can see it.
so Teddy Roosevelt writes, Americanism is a question. Yeah?
So they don't see it.
Can everybody hear it all right?
Yes.
Oh, great, great. Okay, I'll keep reading then. I'm sorry. So Teddy Roosevelt writes, Americanism is a question of spirit, conviction, and purpose, not creed or birthplace. The politician who bids for the Irish or German vote, or the Irishman or German who votes as an Irishman or German is despicable. For all citizens of this Commonwealth should vote solely as Americans. But he is not a whit less despicable than the voter who votes against a good American merely because that American happens to have been born in Ireland or Germany. A Scandinavian, a German, or an Irishman who has really become an American has the right to stand on exactly the same footing as any native-born citizen in the land, and is just as much entitled to the friendship and support and social and political of his neighbors. It's a great quote, you know. In other words, so Teddy Roosevelt really said, once you're here, if you are part of this nation, you are part of this nation. And so those were Teddy Roosevelt's better angels. And for his time in the world, while he was not perfect, Teddy Roosevelt was closer to the side of the angels than many other Americans were in his time frame, you know, in the early 1900s. Teddy Roosevelt also wrote, and this is a great quote he wrote, I have not been able to think out any solution to the terrible problem offered by the presence of the Negro on this continent, but of one thing I am sure, and that is that inasmuch as he is here and can neither be killed nor driven away, the only wise and honorable and Christian thing to do is treat each black man and each white man strictly on his merits as a man, giving him no more and no less than he shows himself worthy to have. So Teddy Roosevelt recognizes differences racially and also says, but we are all Americans and we're all entitled to the opportunity to enjoy what this nation has to offer. So a wonderful thing, isn't it? So his better angels seem to get the better of his life. And to the point, Susan, you know, just heading back to the statue, and, you know, we talked about the last 2 sessions ago, we talked about when they wanted to take down the statue of President Grant, of Ulysses Grant, because he owned a slave. And then what's great is that, you know, that should lead to a conversation as to, well, why did he own a slave? What did he do? And remember, we shared with each other that Ulysses Grant came to believe that slavery was horrific and, you know, released his slave, refused to sell him, even though the slave was worth the equivalent of a nice house in West Hartford. He signed the papers to release him and was really good about integrating his army. And so complexities, and then history helps us to discern the difference between statues that are put up of complex people that don't tell the whole story and statues that are put up for the purpose of oppressing people, like when they put statues up, when the Daughters of the Confederacy, as we talked about 2 sessions ago, put up all kinds of statues so that they could perpetrate, the lost cause, which was that, it's about the Civil War wasn't about slavery. It was about states' rights. It was about white supremacy. That was the stuff it was about. And we want to make sure we can keep people of color in their place. Those statues had a different agenda than statues of Ulysses Grant. And so history is the only way, to your point, John, earlier, that we can see a context and understand the why behind the what. And so my suggestion for all of us, in these turbulent times that we live, is when something is happening to ask ourselves, why is this? Why did this happen? Why was the statue put up? Why is it being taken down? What's the why behind the what? And that helps to give us a context and a better understanding so that we're being, responsive rather than reactionary. It just, because I don't know if you've learned, I've learned that when I had teenagers and I was reactionary to them, it just never went well. And I, as the parent, always lost. I always lost. And so the responsiveness is always better when I could share with them, why did you think that was the best course of action, or why did you make that decision? And I remember one time my now 29-year-old daughter saying, Dad, I liked it better when you just yelled at me instead of asking me to explain the rationale behind my decisions and behavior. She said it was so much easier. And I said, why? And this was, and this is her talking after she's grown and gone. And she said, it was easier, Dad, because I could tune you out and knew you'd eventually run out of steam. So, she said, but when you started asking me why, I had to keep thinking about it. And you just sat there all night till I gave you an answer. Why is always advantageous.
Rick?
Yeah, go for it, Dave.
I just said, I think he was described as a racial moderate in the book.
Great point. Great point. Feel free to expand on it.
And that for now, he was probably very liberal because he did have Booker T. Washington to dinner.
Yes.
But I was more challenged because of the present situation to find out how deep that hegemony goes, that white hegemony. It started with him, with his winning the West, because that certainly was there. Eugenics, you mentioned. The Spencer piece about the survival of the fittest was news to me,
isn't that
as
something?
you said. But, Fisk said manifest destiny. Winston Churchill talked about all about the English speaking peoples. But I guess my problem is that I don't see any change when I read the newspaper. The white hegemony is more important than the racism.
Right.
I find that just challenging, and at least I have a little more depth now.
That is such a marvelous observation, Dave. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you for persevering and getting into the class.
That's another story.
It really is. That whole sense of that white supremacy and that being really a social construct is much deeper, and really shapes so much of what it is we think and how we feel, and things that we're a part of, that we're just a part of, that that we're socialized into. Great point. Thank you so much for that,
But
Dave.
until it was all on the same page, I don't think I put it that much together, and it's not a new thing.
No, right.
It might explain some of what's happening in our country right now. Because of, not the leadership per se. He didn't create the problem, but I think, it's awful to see our cities the way they are. And that seems to be a real important culprit, this idea that not everybody's worth something.
I think you're absolutely right, which goes back to the Civil War, which goes back to the Alien and Sedition Acts, which goes back to the very beginning, and remember, we've talked about, you can even trace it back to Abigail Adams, who, said to John, no slavery when we start a new country, because we're going to pay for it. So you're right. It's so much
very profound
of everything. And Dave, your timing is perfect. I want to show another clip of the Roosevelts. It's 4 minutes long. Good. And we have 6 minutes left. So we'll get in through the wire. And everybody was okay. You could see and hear that video clip all right?
Yes.
Super, super. So I'm going to show it again. I'm going to show a piece having to do with Booker Washington, and we're going to start at 9:42 of the Roosevelt. So I'm going to pull that up and that and 9.
Yeah, well, see, it's, no, we could be on there, but I didn't get the download.
We are. I can't get I'm left-handed. I can't get right to it, so I'm going to go with 9:35. We're going to call that good enough. And let's share this screen again and share both things. And here we go. Everybody can see this all right?
Yes.
Excellent.
That's his wife.
Yeah.
October 17th, 1901, the Atlanta Constitution.
You'll see our seal.
Just before 8 o'clock, a Negro in evening dress presented himself at the White House door and, giving his name, said that he was to dine with the president. Booker Washington has made several visits to the White House, and his face is known there, so he was at once admitted into the private apartment.
Within hours of becoming president, Roosevelt had wired Booker T. Washington, president of the Tuskegee Institute and the most powerful black man in America, asking him to come and see him. Each man wanted something from the other. Negro citizens had been brutally and systematically disenfranchised throughout the South. Washington wanted the new president's assurance that he would continue to appoint African Americans to federal jobs and resist those Republicans who wanted to crack the solid Democratic South by turning the party of Lincoln lily white. Roosevelt, on the other hand, wanted to make sure that he, and he alone, controlled all the black delegates to the Republican convention in 1904. The dinner invitation for Washington was a matter of simple courtesy, he said. The very fact that I felt a moment's qualm on inviting him because of his color made me ashamed of myself and made me send the invitation. A reporter for one of the wire services noticed Washington's name in the register of visitors and filed a story. Although black slaves had built the executive mansion and black servants had waited upon all of its occupants, no black American had ever dined there before. And not only had the president dined with Washington, but he had done so in the company of his wife and teenage daughter, Alice.
White men of the South, how do you like it? White women of the South, how do you like it? The Negro is not the equal of the white man. Mr. Roosevelt might as well try to rub the stars out of the firmament as try to erase that conviction from the hearts of the American people. New Orleans Times, Democrat.
The action of President Roosevelt in entertaining that nigger, said Senator Ben Tillman of South Carolina, will necessitate our killing 1,000 niggers in the South before they will learn their place again. The president was astonished at the furor. I would not lose my self-respect by fearing to have a man like Booker T. Washington to dinner, he wrote, if it cost me every political friend I have got. Washington remained Roosevelt's most important African-American ally. But the president never again asked him or any other black person to dine at the White House.
You know, Dave, that goes right to your point. That goes right to your point, Dave, that you were talking about, you know, in terms of how deeply entrenched all of that is, how he never had anybody else with him, dine with him again that was a person of color in the White House. And so it just shows the power of all that. And just how we're still wrestling with all of that today. And it was impressive that Teddy Roosevelt was willing to admit to the way in which he wrestles, saying the fact that he had a moment's qualm over it, drove him to send the invitation. And then, you know, to go back to John's point, you know, in terms of context of things, you know, I can't help but just psychologizing, you know, what was going through Teddy Roosevelt's mind, you know, in not inviting somebody back. And sometimes I can't help but wonder if there was some fear involved in that when you have a senator like the one from South Carolina who said, you know, this is going to cause us to have to kill 1,000 people, you know, and feeling completely justified in doing so. It's just astonishing. And so, you know, what's interesting is those things don't go away till we address them, do they? And someone has to do the hard work of addressing them. And I suspect that all of us in our careers have had to pay the piper for someone else's mistake. Have you not? And there was a sermon I gave years ago that I really liked, and I'm not going to preach it, I promise. It's 2:01, it's time anyway. But the name of the sermon was, "How much will your sin cost me?" In other words, what you did wrong costs me something. And so, you know, what has happened, we pay the price for, and what are we going to do to make something a little better than it was when we found it? So we'll pick up on that next week, next month.
Do something real quick.
Sure, Susan, go ahead.
When they said that because he invited this black man to dinner with white women, how many lives it would cost of black people. So sometimes if you do the right thing, it has a cost too. That was very chilling to me.
Wasn't that, that's a great observation that you're right. Doing the right thing can have a tremendous cost. It really can. And you think about that, and, you know, you think about, you know, when we fought World War II and World War I, you know, we really wanted to do the right thing, and it cost people dearly on a macro scale. So please forgive me all that we only got about halfway through everything. Do you mind if we just pick up next time?
Sure.
Sure.
Thanks. I'm just going to blame it on Zoom and that it takes me longer to do it this way. We'll just call it that. Thank you all so much for being here. And Lisa, did you have anything you wanted to share?
Thank
you. No, I don't have anything. Just thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks all for your perseverance. I look forward to our time next. I'll see you the first Tuesday in October.
Okay, stay well.
Okay.
Stay well,
Recognize some of
everyone.
these people that are.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks.